Does it feel different to be up there without a rope?
It's obviously like much higher consequence.
People who know a little bit about climbing, they're like, oh, he's totally safe. And then people who really know exactly what he's doing are freaked out.
I've thought about El Cap like for years, and every year I'm like, that's really scary. I'll never be content unless I at least put in the effort. El Cap is the most impressive wall on Earth.
It's 3,200 feet of sheer granite. It's the center of the rock climbing universe.
Obviously, I get interview questions about it all the time. Oh, would you like to do that? And you're like, yes, for sure.
I've always been conflicted about shooting a film about free soloing just because it's so dangerous. It's hard to not imagine your friend falling through the frame to his death.
I think when he's free soloing, that's when he feels the most alive, most everything. How can you even think about taking that away from somebody?
I can't believe you guys are actually gonna watch. Hey Jimmy, do you copy? Just started climbing.
Welcome, Alex. Thank you so much for being here at ClimaCon. So first off, anyone who has not watched Free Solo, immediately go watch it. But spoiler alert, Alex did make that historic climb and live to tell the tale, since he is here with us today. But Alex, thank you. I'm so excited to talk to you about the weather today. And let's jump right into it. How did you think about the weather when you were making that historic climb?
Oh, I mean, it's like, where do you even start? I mean, honestly, weather is one of the biggest factors in climbing, and not just weather, but sort of general conditions. So not the dramatic weather, like whether or not it's storming or not, but also just the general, is it hot? Is it humid? Is it windy? Like kind of the day-to-day basic weather. And I mean, funny thing from the film Free Solo, for anyone who's actually seen the film, it all sort of culminates in this, I hate to ruin it for people who haven't seen it, but it basically culminates in me doing the climb. But in reality, I was ready to do the climb. I was very excited to do the climb, and then it rained the next day. So then I had to go back up to the summit, rappel the whole wall again to double check that nothing had gotten too wet and that basically conditions hadn't changed too much. And then because it's quite tiring to rappel the whole wall and work on a 3,000 foot face like that, then I had to take another rest day, and then I did the actual climb. So it's kind of one of those classic things where it's like the film builds to this climax and you're like, and then he does the thing. But in reality, the weather gets in the way and you actually take 2 days of rest because, you can't force it. If the weather's bad, the weather's bad.
Yeah, so that wasn't included necessarily, but the weather was part of your whole planning process for everything. So I think that's something most people don't think about who aren't climbers. They don't realize that, if the rock is wet, if it's a little bit humid, if it's windy, all of those things put you at risk because, you're on these teeny tiny little holds.
And not just the day-to-day weather like that, but in a broader sense, like if you've seen the film, I had a failed attempt at free soloing El Cap in the fall. And a lot of that was due to sort of weather conditions, like because in the fall, the days are shorter. You have to start in the dark in order to make it to a certain section before it gets sun on the wall. And so you're basically thinking about where the sun tracks across the sky, what time the sun rises, how warm it is, how cold it is, what kind of layers you need. It's like you're constantly evaluating those kinds of conditions. And so in the springtime, it was actually much better conditions overall. But then depending on how heavy the winter's been, then there's a lot of seepage and like runoff down the wall. It means that the snow is melting in the high country. So water comes out of the cracks and comes out of the face. And so you're kind of balancing how quickly the wall will dry versus how soon it gets too hot to climb. Because in the summertime in Yosemite, it's just too hot and you basically get burned when you touch the rock. And so you're constantly juggling all these different variables, trying to, sort of optimize conditions for a successful climb.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So take me through, like, you're thinking about a new project, a new climb that you're going after. What are your steps? Like step one is step one, step two is this.
Well, I mean, if you want a real example, so I've actually spent the last couple of months working on a project near home in Las Vegas, a traverse of the whole range in Red Rock. So there's a bunch of big sandstone peaks. And there are a bunch of things that I've been thinking about. Again, I mean, it's not quite weather, but again, sun and basically moonrise and sunset and all that kind of stuff, I've been kind of waiting for longer days and also trying to time it for a full moon, which is happening right now, basically, so that I can see during the night, because there's a lot of navigation at night, and having a full moon really helps with that kind of thing. But then at the same time, I don't want it to be too late in the year, because then it's too hot and you wind up having to carry way more water. But then if it's too early in the year, then it's too cold and it's basically just too hard to climb because your fingers go numb. And so I actually just abandoned the project for the season because I just had an experience where I went climbing and it was too hot in the sun. But then when I was climbing in the shade, I was in shorts and t-shirts. It was so hot out normally, but then my fingertips went numb on the hard climbing, because when you grab small holds, it kind of forces the blood out of your fingers anyway. And so, those are the factors that you're constantly thinking about as a climber. It's like, is it too hot? Is it too cold? Like, is it too windy? Because also springtime here in the desert is really windy. Like actually today it's raging wind. And so obviously that's not ideal for climbing, because you feel like you're getting buffeted all the time. You're getting pushed around by the wind. And so, anyway, I just punted, I'm just going to do this project later in my life, or maybe in the fall when it's more stable conditions, like less windy, but we'll see.
So how long does it take you to get to know a new location like that? Like, is it difficult to get a good forecast to really understand if you're like traveling around the world, which you do all the time, getting to a new place, completely new weather conditions, new landscape? How do you understand that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly having good forecasts is a huge plus. I mean, to really understand an area deeply as a climber, it kind of requires just spending a lot of time there, because a lot of it isn't just reflected in a forecast. A lot of it's the condition of the rock. And so you kind of need some base understanding of how often things seep. Like what I was just talking about on El Cap in Yosemite. I've spent maybe 10 or 15 spring times there now. So each spring you kind of experience the runoff from the high country, and then you see it dry up over the course of the season. And you start to realize that each night all the seeps come back out, because basically when the sun sets, everything starts to seep out of the rock again. So in the morning, things can be super wet, but then in the afternoon, they can be bone dry again because of the sun. And so you sort of realize the ebb and flow of like constantly changing daily conditions. But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. It's like you can't really. There's no shortcut to experience. You have to just go and put in the time and learn.
Yeah. Do you have any stories of, a time that you went to some place that had really volatile weather and you were caught off guard or surprised or really put at risk?
I'm like, how many do you want to hear?
Let's start with the most dramatic. What's the craziest story?
Okay, I think the craziest weather story I have is probably from Patagonia in southern Argentina. And Patagonia is sort of renowned for some of the strongest winds on Earth, because there's no other land, the roaring 40s and the whatever 50s, like basically those latitudes, is like crazy, crazy wind. And so we were trying to climb these granite spires, sort of iconic peaks. And we hiked in, we camped at the base of the walls, we climbed the walls, and we had a weather forecast, which by the time you hike in, camp a night, and start doing the climbing and everything, your forecast is now a couple of days old. So it's hard to, especially in that area, it's hard to get accurate forecast 3 or 4 days out. And so we thought that we had a 36-hour or 48-hour weather window of like calm conditions. And so we started climbing, and we basically did 24 hours of climbing continuously, like up and over all these peaks. And towards the end of the last peak, it became nuclear wind. Basically, it was like socked in dark clouds, nuclear wind. It was dark at that point, but we couldn't see any stars, and it was just like raging wind. And then we didn't want to abandon the attempt during the night. Like in some ways, it feels light duty to just give up when it's like dark and scary. So we were on at that point ice. So we had like ice screws into the ice, and we were like clipped into this ice wall. And we just hung there holding each other all night, like basically shaking in the wind. It was very cold. So we were just like kind of cuddling, like hanging there on this ice wall. And then eventually the sun came back up the next morning, and conditions had continued to devolve. It had gotten even windier. It was completely black clouds everywhere. And we were like, oh no, like it turns out that the weather just came in much sooner than we expected. It was really gnarly. And so we wound up having to retreat off the other side of the mountain, like basically the opposite side that we had come from, because it was safer to rappel the west side down this like ice wall than it was to rappel this rocky side that we'd come up. And so anyway, we wound up on the wrong side of the mountain range. And long story short, the whole thing was a 54-hour push, and we did the final 24 hours without food. We had to walk all the way around a mountain range with no food at the end. So we did this 20-hour death march, like out from the mountains. And it was one of those classic things where, the weather forecast, had we had 6 more hours of good conditions, we would have summited the peak we were trying and then rappelled down the same side that we'd come from. It would have been fine. But instead, because we were a little too slow or the weather came a little too soon, we wound up having to hike back to town a whole different way. So our tent, our sleeping bags, like all of our equipment all just like blew out to sea, presumably. I mean, we never saw them again. So that was definitely the end of our expedition because we lost all of our gear. And after a 54-hour push, you're so crushed that I changed my ticket and just flew home. I was like, well, that was a good adventure. Like, I guess I'm done.
Oh, that sounds like an absolute nightmare. I'm sure to everyone listening is just like, what?
No, I mean, we also were like, oh, it certainly wasn't what we planned for.
Yes, obviously.
But it is like a good experience in some ways because we both sort of realized what we were capable of, because when you're 54 hours in and you're still going, you're like, well, it turns out, I never would have done that by choice, but being forced to in sort of a survival situation, you're like, well, it turns out, I can do a lot more than I would have expected for myself.
That's true. Yeah, it's like ideally you would have had a weather forecast that was a little bit more accurate, but you couldn't. So therefore.
Yeah, though actually that story aside, better weather forecasts are a big reason that Patagonia climbers have been more successful over the last 10 years or so. And I've had actually, the next year we went back and we did successfully do that traverse. And it was the first time it had been done. It was sort of a big event in climbing. And so, a lot of those successes in Patagonia do stem from having better weather forecasts now. And a big part of being a good Patagonia climber now is to interpret the weather forecast well, because my favorite partner and I, the person that we hiked around this mountain range with, he's really good at interpreting the different weather forecasts and sort of making sense of all the data. And we've had a lot of experiences where we're hiking into the mountains to do something big and challenging. And as we hike in, we pass other parties of climbers who are hiking out looking completely thrashed because they just survived some like horrendous weather experience because they basically made the wrong call where they're like, oh, I think this like period of unstable conditions might be good. And you're like, no, it turns out it's really bad. But there's nothing more personally satisfying than when you hike in about to do something amazing and it's like sunny and beautiful and somebody else is hiking out looking completely destroyed from like a survival situation they just had. And you're like, ooh, somebody misinterpreted the weather.
That's hilarious. You're just like, oh, guys should really work on that. Sorry.
And that's the kind of thing that kind of can end your season. Like I was just saying, I mean, we made one bad call and it completely thrashed us. We lost all of our gear and then we all went home. So it's like, if you make the wrong call a couple times in a row, I mean, that's the end of your season.
Yeah. Let alone if you could have some sort of life-threatening injury or something else terrible happen. Like that is also a possibility. Not that we want to talk about that, but it is a factor.
No, that is definitely that. I mean, most of the climbing accidents that have happened in Patagonia, like most climbing fatalities in Patagonia, the weather is always a factor. It's like people, break their ankle or something, but then the mountains are so remote and difficult to get in and out of that then when a storm comes, then they unfortunately die in the storm basically because it's so hard to move in and out of the mountains. Yeah, no, I mean, it is definitely something to think about and something that we keep in mind. I mean, it is important to not get caught in the weather there.
Yeah, I'm curious. What are you actually using to forecast? Do you have like 80 weather apps on your phone? Do you actually talk to a meteorologist? Like, how do you make that call?
Honestly, so I make that call by mostly climbing with my friend Colin Haley, who's really good at it. So he and a couple other people in town have a whole system where they look at all this weather data from, I think, the Argentinian military, or maybe it's like naval stuff from Chile or Argentina. But basically, they always have kind of a half dozen tabs open on their computer and they're like cross-referencing all these crazy lines. And I honestly don't totally know how it all works, but I just do what Colin tells me because he's now spent 15 seasons there, both in winter and in summer. And he's incredibly experienced to that kind of thing. And so, sometimes you just defer to your partner's expertise.
Yeah, I was just curious because, that is part of our goal here at Tomorrow is increasing weather access globally. We have a plan to launch a constellation of satellites into space to really improve weather forecasting, specifically in remote areas like Patagonia. So that's something that's pretty exciting for us to think about the possibilities.
No, I mean, that's the kind of thing I can't wait. You know, I mean, if I could pull up a normal weather forecast for an area like Patagonia and make sense of it, it would be a tremendous asset. I'd be like, oh, this is so helpful. On the other hand, then it would be helpful for all the other climbers as well. And so you'd get a little bit less of that satisfaction when you nail or when you make the right call and other people don't, you know.
That's true. You'd be losing a little bit of that competitive edge if everyone else has a great forecast.
Overall, it would be great for climbing generally because it'd be safer for everyone and just better off. I mean, and things like us losing our tent in the wind with all our equipment. I mean, that's kind of a terrible environmental sort of issue. It's like you don't really want all your synthetic equipment to blow away because presumably it winds up in the ocean. And that's something that we're very much trying to avoid. But, you know, sometimes you just get crushed in a storm. And yeah, it's certainly something that I would prefer to have a better forecast for.
Definitely. And I think that's a great segue actually to talk about some of your environmental work with the Honnold Foundation. So what made you want to start the organization and what are some of your goals that you're working towards?
Well, so I started the Honnold Foundation, I think almost 10 years ago now, with a fairly simple goal of just trying to do something useful in the world. I mean, it basically just stemmed from me being relatively comfortable as a climber and feeling like I should do something useful. As that's turned out, that means supporting solar projects around the world for a more equitable world, basically supporting solar energy projects, mostly because I personally felt like energy access was sort of a base human need. And through a lot of the different expeditions I've been on and places that I've traveled, I'd kind of seen that access to energy was sort of a foundational element for human development, basically. Yeah, so we're supporting projects all over. It's been a tremendously satisfying process.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do you feel like as a climber, you feel more strongly about, you know, sustainability, preserving the environment because you're in it all the time and you're using nature in a weird way, in a different way than most people would?
Yeah, I think it's totally fair to say that because I spend so much time in nature, I mean, I have maybe a little more appreciation for sort of the physical world that we live in. I mean, yeah, for sure. And, you know, it's just one of those classic things. You spend all your time, it's like you spend all your time outdoors, you want to protect it in whatever way you can, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, we're really also focusing on this concept of climate resilience here, trying to help people better plan for the changing climate and understand how that impacts them. So, you know, for you as a climber, have you thought about that? How, you know, the weather might be changing, weather patterns might be changing, that, you know, the fact that you know exactly when the water is going to seep out of the wall at Yosemite, if that could change and that could actually change how you have to climb.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, actually, the biggest thing that I think of with climate change and climbing is receding glaciers and the changes in mountain, basically in the composition of mountains. So, for example, I mean, I keep coming back to Patagonia, but I've done 4 or 5 expeditions there now, and just in the time that I've been going to Patagonia, which is the last 5 years or 7 years at this point, the approaches into some of the climbs have changed because the glaciers have receded so far that you now hike the opposite way around some of the lakes that form at the end of the glacier. And that's one of those things that is pretty striking. I mean, and when you talk about my foundation, I mean, that's a big part of why I started the Honnold Foundation, is because I feel like the transition to renewable energy and basically any kind of effort to reduce human impact is critical because, I'm personally seeing drastic changes in mountainscapes, just over the span of less than a decade. And I mean, in terms of geology, that's nothing. When you think that the last ice ages last, thousands of years, and then I'm like, oh, in the last 5, I've seen this glacier recede so far that you now hike on the north side of the lake instead of the south side of the lake because it's completely changed the shape of this valley. I mean, that's pretty shocking, really, And then, I've also been to the highest peaks in Africa, like Mount Kenya and Mount Kilimanjaro, which both are some of the rare glaciated peaks in the tropics, both of which are receding incredibly quickly and basically won't have ice on them soon. I mean, so you see things like that. And I read climbing journals and climbing sort of accounts of people who did the first ascent of some of these routes. Like on Mount Kenya, there was a striking route called the Diamond, which is like a big hanging glacier ice field. It was basically like an ice route that people climbed up the peak that now doesn't exist. Like full stop, it's just not there. And so, it's kind of crazy to think that people, like basically the previous generation of climbers, were doing things that just don't exist anymore. Like it's funny, in the US there's so much debate around climate change, it's like, but I think that's the kind of thing that you can only really do when you live in suburbia or like in an urban setting and you're just not out in the mountains, like exposed to weather like that all the time. Because when you live in a city, you're like, oh yeah, it's about the same as it normally is. It like might be a tiny bit hotter, but I don't really notice that much. But when you're out in the mountains, you're like, dude, there used to be a glacier here and there isn't anymore. It's like you can physically see the change. It's pretty wild.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Okay.
Sorry to rant like that, but it's one of those things that when you're going on expeditions to remote mountains around the world, it's like you just can't help but notice the conditions changing very quickly.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear that, and that's what I was wondering exactly. So, I think we have time for just one more crazy weather story. I would love to end on that. So do you have one other crazy one about a time that you were climbing and you had to completely drastically change your plans?
I don't know. I mean, well, I don't know if I have any quite as crazy as the Patagonia, because when you get into 54-hour pushes and 20-hour death marches in the snow, it's like, really what I have are tons and tons of day-to-day stories where, I mean, I think that the thing that's maybe underappreciated with climbing, I think a lot of people watch, a YouTube video of me free soloing something, or even they watch the film Free Solo and they think that I just walk up and climb cliffs. But the reality is that I'm constantly evaluating like a ton of different conditions, both the weather and then also my personal feeling of like, how's my skin? How are my muscles? Am I tired? And then it's like, am I tired today, but the weather is worse tomorrow? Is it better to just go today while I'm tired or climb in worse conditions the next day when I physically feel better? It's like literally my whole life is a juggling act of looking at the weather, considering conditions, and then occasionally considering, should I just leave this area and go somewhere that's fundamentally cooler? Because, I lived out of a van for 12 years, basically because I was following the weather nonstop. It's like, as soon as it rained for 3 days in a row, you'd start to second guess your entire purpose and be like, should I just move further south? Should I go to the desert? It's like, because as soon as you have to take a couple forced rest days that you didn't want to because the weather's bad, you're like, am I doing everything wrong? Should I rethink my whole strategy? That's why you live in a van, so you can constantly move to a new area and search for good conditions.
That makes sense. I guess I personally wouldn't live in a van, but yeah, I get it.
If your main goal in life was to climb as well as possible, then it is and honestly, my van is as nice as a lot of little apartments in New York or something. It's comfortable. It has a kitchen, it's fine. It's like my little mobile studio apartment and the main thing about the van is that my backyard is incredible. Anytime you open the van, you're in one of the most beautiful places on earth in a national park, enjoying, everything it has to offer. It's definitely worth it if you're trying to maximize your climbing.
That makes total sense. Yeah, I definitely agree with you that I feel like climbing is one of the most intellectual sports. It's very much about analysis and deeply considering all of those variables. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting compared to mainstream sports where you just show up at the arena and just play whenever you're scheduled to. With climbing, you're constantly deciding, is it better later? Will it be, should I move? Should I go elsewhere? It's like, should I go indoors and train and then, wait for better conditions outdoors? It's like this you're just constantly thinking about the weather.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is all of the time that we have. This was so much fun talking to you about all of this. Is there anything else that you want to just tell people about before we go?
No. Honestly, it's a pleasure to talk about things like this because almost every time anyone asks me about anything, it's like, how do you manage fear? What do you think about death? And I'm like, all those kinds of things like managing risk, things like that, they matter. But I think that the weather and sort of general conditions underscore everything that you do as a climber. Like basically being in nature and being at the whim of nature, it's like if it's too cold and windy, you can't climb, and that's just the way it is. And I think that that's a very underappreciated aspect of what we do as climbers. And so it's kind of a pleasure to talk about it because really we are at the whim of the natural world.
Thank you so much, Alex. This was wonderful. And thank you all so much.
No, thank you. Pleasure chatting.